Hello everyone, it's February 28th, 2016, and you're looking at episode 33 of Percussion. I'm your host, Casey Cangelosi, and with me as always are Laurel Black.
Hi.
Megan Arns.
Hello.
And Ben Charles.
Hi everybody.
So with us is one of today's most prolific composers. He's well commissioned and well performed worldwide. He's a holder of many prestigious international prizes in composition, and in many highly esteemed reviews, he's been called an intensely musical mind, aesthetically breathtaking, and holding the torch for the future of new opera. These quotes among many, many, many others. So joining us today from London, England is Alejandro Viñao.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hey, very good. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us, and we know you are a very, very busy composer, and it's just great to have you.
It's a real pleasure.
So, what are you working on right now, Alejandro? What's happening there in your studio in London?
I am working on a piece for mixed marimba, well, for live acoustic marimba and electroacoustic or electronic means, sounds, which is a commission from China. And I haven't worked with electronics for some time. Actually, the last time was about 4 years ago. I did a piece for 12 singers and electronics. So it's I used to work a lot more with mixed pieces, but this is the way it turned out the last few years. Yes, I'm quite excited about this because I wanted to write a piece for marimba and electronics for many years, but you know, the commissions kept coming in a different direction. People wanting, everybody liked the idea of having a piece for marimba and electronics, but everybody hated the idea of touring with the gear. So they say, yeah, a great piece, but actually, yeah, if I'm gonna go in a tour, I have to carry a 5-octave marimba or whatever. It's already big enough, and so there's always been. People have made noises about commissioning such a piece, but ended up commissioning something else. So yeah, I'm happy, and it's almost finished the piece, and I'm quite happy with it. It was fun, actually.
What is the electronic part like?
Well.
If you don't mind asking.
Yeah, no. It's first of all will have to be played with a click track, I'm afraid. So that's the maybe the drawback, in the sense that the kind of interaction between the marimba and the electronics requires a click track. So it's a little bit like my other piece, which has electronics for percussion, which is tumblers for violin, marimba, and electronics. You also need a click track.
I'm going to take a wild guess that the rhythms are hard.
Actually, easier than tumblers. A lot easier than tumblers. And you will be surprised to see that there are some stretches which are all in 4.
Wow.
Impossible.
Losing your edge.
Yeah. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that that what you have to play is, or the interaction between the electronics and the computer and the marimba, because it's in 4, is necessarily easier. But yeah, at least you don't have the problem of having to count like there's no tomorrow. So that's one issue. I think it's mechanically also technically easier. Partly because, of course, when you have the aid of electronics, you can afford to give to the electronics part a lot of the things that you would otherwise, if it were a solo piece, have to give to the player. And some of it you think, oh, this will sound even better if it's some sound that I'm creating that will blend very well or resonate very well with the marimba. So it solves the mechanical problem and it sounds better. So yeah, in that sense, I think it's. I'm not going to say it's an easy piece, because every time I say it's an easy piece, people say, "Well, yeah, come on, that's not easy." Okay, maybe it's not as hard as can variations, but it is still. So, but I think it's yeah, much easier than, say, play can variations.
I had a couple questions. One, when is it going to be premiered?
Well, after it's been after it's premiered in Beijing, presumably, then which will be, well, I don't know when it will be premiered. When I finish it and deliver it, which will be probably in the next 2-3 weeks. After that, however long it takes to learn and then find the appropriate event to premiere it.
Most importantly, when is it available for public consumption? When can
I'm not sure about that actually, but probably maybe in say 8 months or something like that.
Okay.
It's about that kind of time span.
I had a question, just wondering about electronics. One thing, a lot of the time when I hear pieces for percussion and electronics, something that was composed in 1995 sounds extremely dated to the point that most of the time I don't want to hear it. But then when I look at tumblers, which I think was 1992, if I remember correctly, or somewhere in that time frame.
1990, I think.
Yeah, and it's strange. Like, it does not sound at all dated. It sounds like it was made yesterday. And even some of the newer pieces that are made sound very dated to me. So could you tell us a little bit about first working with the electronics on tumblers, exactly how what sort of software or hardware you used on that, and then in your opinion, what is it about your music that's made this electronics stick so well?
Well, I mean, it's not a simple question to answer, because I think there are at least two aspects to that question. The first one is that to a very considerable extent, the degree to which we feel the electronics are dated or not is not a function of how well produced, made the electronic sounds are, but more a function of how they interact with the acoustic instrument, in this case marimba, but it could be with any other acoustic instrument. The interaction with the marimba actually is easier. With instruments like the voice, it's much more complex, or I think it's more complex. So if the interaction is well thought and it makes musical sense both at the bar-to-bar level, syntactical local level, and it also makes sense in terms of the overall form of the piece, even if the sound, you can say, well, that sound is FM produced in the 70s, clear, because it's frequency modulation, and that is that, and that's whatever. You are not going to think it's dated. In the same way that when we hear a recorder, we don't think it's dated, or we hear old instruments. On the contrary, we think, oh, that's how charming. It sounds like, from a different age. Because if the music is well put together, the problem is that in the beginning of this adventure of writing for mixed instruments, acoustic instruments and electroacoustic means, people found it difficult to figure out how these two worlds, seemingly incompatible, could be structured together so that they would make sense, so that the listener would not constantly feel that he's listening to two things that don't really talk to it, two structures that don't talk to each other. Why is this sound coming and happening now while I hear the marimba or the voice or whatever doing something else? What is the connection between the two? I think in my pieces in general, especially in my vocal pieces, but in general, I have tried to create an electroacoustic sound that is an extension of the sound world of the acoustic instrument or voice that I'm using. And when it is an extension, for example, maybe using sound morphing or some transformation of the sound, that already links the sounds together. So even if the sound maybe doesn't have the definition or the number of bits or whatever that we can get together with today with the technology of today, that integration makes it more convincing. And then the discourse, the musical discourse, again, has to be convincing. And if those things are convincing, then the piece of course, it ages in a sense when we hear, a piece from the Age of Enlightenment. It feels old. It feels, Haydn feels old, but it still sounds right for that time, and you accept it in that way. It ages in the sense that you're saying when it doesn't work. There is, of course, also a question of the dexterity with which, yes, of course, with which you make sounds, and not everybody is equally good or has the skill or the intuition or the time often to spend in the working with electronic sounds until they are absolutely right. They just get a sound, they think it more or less works, they work, and they leave it at that. And sometimes you have to be prepared to spend an inordinate amount of time, so much time that it's not for everybody. Because, I can tell you now that normally a piece that has electronics takes between 2 and 3 times longer to write than a piece for acoustic instruments. So there's also the question of, is anybody going to pay you 2 to 3 times more? And the answer, of course, is no. So people tend to cut corners. There are all these issues. It's a complex issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've made that mistake in commissioning people, like just assuming that, oh yeah, and maybe you could add electronics, and like not realizing that it takes so much extra time, that component.
I would say that basically I say this to students and to young composers. Electronics is what you do after you've learned to write for orchestra, string quartets. When you've really, really mastered acoustic instruments, then you get into electronics because it's much harder. If you think you have difficulty writing for orchestra, don't bother with electronics. It's much, much harder. All you're going to do is put together some samples that are never going to convince anybody. And people are going to say, well, if I'm going to listen to that, I'd rather listen to, hard rock or whatever, which is better produced. So the idea that, oh, this is easy because, I have a MIDI sequencer and I can put together some samplers, is very deceiving. It is much harder. You have to make the sound from scratch. So if orchestration is difficult because you have to imagine things, but at least you have 500 years of tradition on which you can rely to see how somebody else did it. Whereas with electronics, you have very little tradition, and most of them failed anyway. So you're on your own there.
Wow.
So it is going to be much harder.
I think also, a flute is always going to sound like a flute, or a trumpet's always going to sound like a trumpet. And like you're kind of hitting at here, the electronics can sound like anything. There's no limit to it, which I think opens up a whole, can of possibilities.
Yeah. And the more possibilities, like Stravinsky said at one point, the more possibilities you have, if you're not limited by something, that doesn't help. That doesn't give you freedom. That gives you confusion. And I think you have to be very careful with that.
Going all the way back to what Ben said about new electronic sounds versus older electronic sounds, it seems today, in the little bit I've dabbled in this, all the new synthesizers, they always have the old settings, like they imitate the Moog, and like the Moog is really hip now. You see people buying, recreations of the Moog, and you buy software packages that have all these vintage synthesizers on them. So it's interesting that new pieces, often sound like the old pieces.
Yeah, but I mean, I would, okay, that's not ideal, but I wouldn't even worry too much about that.
Yeah.
If somebody used completely standard run-of-the-mill sounds you can download from somewhere online that are just simply the same old sounds you hear in commercials and television and films and whatever, if you're going to do something with that is interesting with them, in a way it would be even more exciting, because imagine hearing those sounds that you've heard ad nauseum in TV commercials, films, whatever, now used to create large-scale form in a meaningful way. And if you can integrate them into a piece, you have the benefit of something that is very familiar but in a new context. So even that is not necessarily a problem. The problem is always a compositional problem, not the sound in itself.
It reminds me of a conversation I had with my dad a long time ago, where we were comparing, say, old cartoons to new 3D animated movies, and my dad would say, well, it's so easy. They just do that with computers now. Computers just do that. They used to draw all those cartoons by hand. And I'm thinking, but wait, the product is so different. They still take the same amount of effort. So even though they could use the computers to just draw the same old cartoons, we've chosen not to. We've chosen to use the technology to do something that you can't do by hand. And it's just like really fascinating to me. Like, good artists never seem to go the lazy route. It's like, why doesn't Pixar just make the same quality Disney cartoons that we've had for years? It's like they don't. They have this advantage of new computers and technology, but yet they still have elevated it to this like new thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Megan. Megan, what the heck is this? What's going on? What is this?
Get that!
I have this, and
How did you get that?
You need to explain yourself. That's what you need to do. Anyway, shout out to Megan Arns on this new opera CD real quick.
She hides. She's gone.
Oh wow, that was like way funner than I thought it would be. I thought that'd be a little fun.
I can send you one.
That was like really fun.
I think, Casey, I think you might have to explain the picture for people who are just listening.
Oh, well, yeah, it's part of an opera. It's a steampunk opera, Deus Ex Machina by Robert J. Bradshaw, called, Who's Who? I don't know. Megan, can you explain a little real quick?
Yeah, oh, well, yeah, that Who's Who is just the program book of
okay,
who's
got
a part of it. But, yeah, it's an electroacoustic opera composed by Robert Bradshaw, and we did it all from a distance, so all the tracks were kind of put together in different places. So I haven't met a lot of the people actually, but I worked on a project with Robert called the Music of Difference Project a couple years ago, and so he asked me to record a timpani track for this. But the hard part was not recording the timpani track. It was trying to find steampunk gear, to wear for this program book. It was really hard, so I contacted the opera department here at my school and kind of went shopping through their, the opera director helped me kind of put that all together, and then so
hey,
yeah. Anyway, it's a little embarrassing, the picture, but
Oh, that's excellent. Hey, I'd like to shoot a Facebook question to Alejandro real quick, since I already kind of wrecked the nice flow we had going there. But Ryan asks, what is your process for starting a new piece? Is there anything you consistently do before or while putting the first notes on the page?
Yeah, well, I cannot think of anything I do consistently before or at the time I start a piece. I mean, I don't have a systematic procedure. I think it varies from piece to piece, and it has changed also throughout the years. But there isn't an infinite number of ways in which I start a piece. I probably choose or find myself going in following one line or another from a relatively small repertoire of possibilities. I can give you an example, or perhaps 3 different examples that illustrate the point. Let's say I have some idea that I think has potential, which could be a melodic cell or a rhythmic cell, or any musical idea, but which is already note material. I want to explore it in my mind. So what I may do is I may go for a walk. And I like thinking about music when I'm walking. It's something that feels natural to me. So I'll go for a walk and I may start composing in my mind. And some of it I probably forget by the time I come back home, and I can write it down. But it doesn't bother me. My mind gets going and starts toying with that idea. And the material probably that I forget is the one that is not so good, and probably the one that is interesting will stick and come back at some point. So that's one way I would start the compositional process going. But sometimes I have no idea, no point of departure that is obvious to me that I can think of. So what I would do in that case is I would listen to a lot of music by other composers, perhaps from other cultures, perhaps from popular music or classical music, a range of things. But usually I'm not choosing to listen to music randomly. Sometimes I do, but sometimes it's already related to some kind of idea or purpose I have. For example, the last piece I finished, which is the last percussion piece I finished, which is a percussion trio. I was going to write the third movement. And the first movement was based on a riff, but it was a rock sort of what you might say felt like progressive rock riff from, say, the 70s, something like that, early 70s. And the second movement had nothing to do with a riff. And I thought it would be nice to end up with a different kind of riff. So there would be this kind of arch of symmetry. For the last movement, it would be nice if it were a riff that came from the jazz tradition rather than from the hard rock tradition. But I had no immediate idea of how, what riff it should be. And then I remembered that Lenny Tristano liked riffs, and that his music was always very influential. Not a jazz musician that everybody listens to, but certainly one who was very influential in the 50s, and the perhaps listened to by the big names of that time, who considered him very highly, although the audience perhaps didn't. And then I remembered, so I listened to some of his music. Then I remembered one track I had heard a long time ago, which was a very crazy treatment of a riff, where he used electroacoustic means to record one line with this riff, and then change the speed and then record something else. So he was doing something kind of almost Nancarrow-esque, but back in the 50s, I think it was, or very early 60s. And that sounded incredible because it had the feel and the sound of the jazz sound world of Lenny Tristano, but with this very Nancarrow-esque multiple simultaneous times. So I went back to that piece. I found it on YouTube. I use YouTube a lot now. I found the piece. I started listening to it, and it gave me some ideas. And so I took the central or the riff and the way in which he was using it, but think about what sort of processes he was dealing with, and how I could change that and use it to do something different. And then that's how I started working on the piece. I started from listening to somebody else and being and extracting from the ideas of the composer some kind of concept that I could then take somewhere else. So that's exactly the opposite or very different from the first way in which I started a piece. And then there is another way. If I'm writing a piece that involves electronics, then sometimes the technology or the technological problems involved that may determine how I start writing the piece. Because if, for example, I want to write a piece, say, for voice and electronics, and I've decided that I want to have morphs from the voice to, say, inharmonic sounds, and then back from inharmonic sounds to the voice, that's a hard thing to do. And so I have to find the software that will do it, see if it works, and how it works. And so, for example, I may find out that the morph requires more seconds than I thought it would to be convincing. So that means that it will be a more slower moving piece. So then it drives me in a direction where I start thinking about music that is slow moving. So in that case, the technological problems before you start writing the actual music notes on your score, they are conditioning and driving the compositional process to some degree. So it's difficult to pin it down to one approach. There are many possible approaches, and sometimes the three approaches I just described are combined together in the beginning of a piece.
I have a question about Ryan's question. Why do you think anytime people are interviewing or talking to a composer, the question is always, what's your process and what inspires you? It seems like that's always the question.
Well, I think perhaps, I mean, I don't know who is asking these questions, or I mean, I don't always know who's asking these questions, but I would imagine composers would ask questions that have to do with processes because they want to hear about something that they may use themselves in their own music. When I was very young and I went to Darmstadt and heard Ligeti talk for the first time, well, I was very interested in hearing, yes, of course, I loved his music and it was Ligeti and all the rest of it. But ultimately, what I wanted to see if I could get something out of him that I could use in my own music. So there is this utilitarian approach, in the good sense, I mean, is that you want to hear something about the process to see if you can learn something that is useful to you. So I would imagine that that's what's driving that question in some cases, at least in many cases. The inspiration one, well, is a classic one, but I think it's often I don't want to say it's a wrong question, but it's a question that assumes that inspiration is what drives the compositional process in the sense.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering. Yeah, thank you. Continue, please.
The inspiration, what does inspiration mean? The problem is that we all think we know, and perhaps we all do know, but it means a different thing for each of us. It's like, you know, we all know what love is, but every time we proceed to give a definition, we probably give an entirely different definition than other people might give. So inspiration could be, you know, my teacher, my composition teacher when I was young was a Russian who came to Argentina in 1923. He used to make fun of you if you ever mentioned inspiration. He said, oh, you don't, because if you said, yo, maestro, I'm sorry I didn't show up with my string quartet that you asked me to write because I wasn't inspired, he would say, oh, but open the door, inspiration would come through the window or something like that. He always was poking fun at you. Inspiration, what's inspiration? I don't care how you start the piece. Choose any theme. You want a theme, I'll give you a theme. I can tell you a place where they sell them by the dozen. Is what you do with the original idea that makes the piece, not the inspiration that you get to begin the piece. But of course, somebody may say, well, by inspiration I mean a conceptual inspiration about the process. You know, how do you, what made you think, what made Nancarrow think, oh, perhaps music could go, you know, you could have music where the layers move at different rates and different speeds, different tempi. What inspired him, if you want to think about multitemporality? Well, you can use the term inspiration that way. I wouldn't. I would say that, you know, he probably got to think about multitemporality because he was a child of his time, and at that time it was possible, and other people before him had thought about it, and he listened to the Rite of Spring where there is an implication of multitemporality already there. And other composers, and he thought, oh, but I now have pianolas and I can do it. I can really explore this. Is that an inspiration? Is that an insight? Well, I don't know. You can call it what you will, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I feel like young composers or people who are trying to get started in composition think that you have to be feeling this really fluffy magic the whole time, and as soon as it comes down to hard work, they think, oh, well, I'm not inspired, so I'm doing it wrong. And it's great to hear you say, yeah, it's hard work sometimes.
Well, I mean, you know what Einstein said, it's 99% effort, 1% talent.
Yeah.
That's actually true, I think.
Yeah, I always tell them, yeah, the inspiration is that short, and then it's just a matter of like chasing it after then, and it's difficult. Hey, let's go ahead and move to Ben. You've mentioned this composer Nancarrow.
Yeah, well, real quick, before we talk about that, I just wanted to, I think I've mentioned this a couple times before actually, but I finished reading the book Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, who's one of the founders of Pixar. And he talks a lot about this idea of like inspiration, and it's funny, Casey, that you asked that. Like, why is everyone so interested in what your process is? And in this book, he talks a lot about randomness and how, you know, just because a process worked one time for Alejandro Viñao, it doesn't mean it will work for me if I try to write a piece, much less Viñao again. So yeah, I would really recommend that book if anyone's interested in like creativity and inspiration and how all that comes together, because he has a lot of interesting thoughts about how you can duplicate success without duplicating a process, if that makes sense. But anyway, I'm here today partially to talk about the music of Nancarrow, who Alejandro just mentioned, and who is, I think Alejandro would admit, one of his greatest influences as a composer. So I haven't had a chance to check this out, but Kyle Gahn, who's a music critic and composer, has a book called The Music of Nancarrow. So if anyone's interested in further research on this, that's definitely a good resource. Additionally, Alejandro on his website has an excellent radio program that he put together. It's a little over an hour, called Children of Nancarrow. And it really, it doesn't go too kind of deep into the explanation of Nancarrow's music. It's more of, you know, the evolution of it and how different composers have used this idea of multiple tempi going on, which we'll get to in a minute. But some of the composers he mentions on that are with audio excerpts are Luca Francesconi, Alejandro Viñao himself, Javier Alvarez, Charles Amir Kanayan, is that how you say it? Amir Canyon, Moritz Eggert, and not as a descendant of Nancarrow, but perhaps as a predecessor, also Charles Ives with his Universe Symphony, which I actually found a very interesting, short, about 3-minute video of the Nashville Symphony putting on a construction, so to speak, of that piece, if anyone's interested in looking into it. But this composer, Nancarrow, kind of created this interest, as Alejandro puts it on this radio program. He says, not an interest in melody against melody, but they seek an interest in time against time. So the idea of having multiple tempos going on simultaneously that may or may not be kind of proportionally related, as we think of like 3 against 4 or so on. Nancarrow was born in Texarkana, Arkansas on October 27th, 1912. He died in Mexico City on August 10th, 1997. As a youth, he played trumpet in a jazz band. Upon graduation from high school, he went to study at Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and then privately continued studying in Boston with Roger Sessions, Walter Piston, and Nicholas Linemski. And an interesting tidbit about Walter Piston is that in addition to teaching Nancarrow, his students also included Leroy Anderson, Leonard Bernstein, and Elliott Carter, so quite a diverse bunch there. Additionally, Nancarrow met Arnold Schoenberg when he was in Boston in 1933, so that provided kind of an additional influence over him. When he was in Boston, he joined the Communist Party, and actually in the late 1930s went to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and he returned to New York City, where many of the people that had done the same thing that he had kind of faced political harassment for their communist views. So he left the U.S. and went to Mexico in 1940, and he remained basically the rest of his life in Mexico. He became a Mexican citizen in 1956, and he visited the U.S. a few times after that, but ultimately decided that he was not interested in rejecting his previous views to return to the U.S. So Nancarrow, as far as I know, he got the idea actually from Henry Cowell, who suggested that just like we have ratios of frequencies that create intervals, so an octave is, you know, twice the frequency of one octave below it, and so on, that perhaps we could do something similar with mathematical ratios of time. And Cowell actually has a piece called, I think it's called Fugue, for, I think it might be 4 flexitones or something like that. But yeah, it's the same sort of idea as Nancarrow, of having multiple tempi interacting instead of multiple sort of harmonic ratios. So as you can imagine, this music becomes incredibly complex and difficult, and Nancarrow had difficulty finding suitable performers, especially in Mexico, where the classical music scene wasn't so big when he was composing. So he got his hands on a pianola, a player piano, and basically started to make piano rolls of his music to be able to actually realize it and hear it, which was kind of an interesting take on technology at the time, because first of all, that's not what that instrument was intended to do originally. But he's certainly, it's certainly very good at that. But it's also a way that he solved his problem before we had Pro Tools and click tracks and could make, these multiple tempi click tracks, which we are starting to see as a common practice now for performing Xenakis, Pleiad, and so on. So his earliest pieces actually combined harmonic language and melodic riffs of jazz pianists like Art Tatum. In fact, his first 5 piano rolls are called the Boogie Woogie Suite, which it's really interesting because you hear this boogie woogie piano music, but in these very bizarre kind of tempo relationships. His later works had no obvious references to extant music. As he would continue to experiment with these multiple tempi, he was interested in even more complicated ratios and even irrational fractions. So, for example, 1 to pi ratio or something like that, not 2 to 4, something like that. And he also began to have lines at one tempo would accelerate or decelerate instead of just containing them at one tempo. So for as advanced as his compositions were and as brilliant as all this is, he went actually largely ignored for most of his life as a composer because he was so isolated from the kind of Western classical music scene in Mexico. And then in the kind of mid-70s and 1980s, Peter Garland, who published a magazine, started to recognize his work, and György Ligeti discovered Nancarrow's music, and Ligeti called it the greatest discovery since Webern and Ives, something great and important for all music history. His music is so utterly original, enjoyable, perfectly constructed, but at the same time emotional. For me, it's the best music of any composer living today. And then in more recent years, there have actually been some live performances. The 2 groups that I recognize particularly where Alarm Will Sound and Bang on a Can All-Stars have both created arrangements of his piano rolls, which I'm assuming they use click tracks for, to do live performances of his music. So this kind of idea of having these multiple tempos going on is abundant in Alejandro's music. And Alejandro, I heard him give a lecture before where basically he has, I hesitate to use the word simplified, but I'll go ahead and use it, simplified these very complex ratios, or taken these ideas and made them somewhat more human, so they're, I think, more performable or more accessible to most performers. So yeah, that is Conlon Nancarrorw for any uninitiated fans out there.
Ben, I think you're super brave to always do these segments with the expert in the room.
No, I mean, you've done fantastic, clearly very good research on the matter, because that was a very good introduction to Nancarrow, much better than I would have done myself.
Did you have the chance to meet him, Alejandro?
I met him briefly in London. There was a festival in the 80s called the Almeida Festival, and he had a piece performed there, and he was flown in by the arrangers of the organizers of the festival. I had a piece there as well, so we met in a social situation after a concert or something. And of course, I was just beginning to get interested in his music at that time. So I met him briefly. I didn't have a chance to ask him about what you said before, whether he got this idea from Henry Cowell but my take is that he got his idea from The Rite of Spring, not from Henry Cowell. And I tell you why. Because he does talk about the Rite of Spring in some places, and there is a passage in the Rite of Spring which is called the Cortège des Sages, the procession of the sages.
Which right before the big bass drum excerpt for any percussionist.
So basically, any percussionist will remember that the Gran Casa, the bass drum, starts in 3, okay, and then you have a tune in the French horns, and the woodwinds are doing something in 4, and the French horn is doing it in something that doesn't fit into any time signature, or it would have to be 16 or something, and then the trumpets come in, and he piles up all of these layers that are in different time signatures, but of course they're still in the same tempo, and so when the piling up reaches the point where it's too dense, then the music stops there. but you can hear very clearly that each layer as it comes in is in a different time signature.
Yeah, that part actually, as a quick aside, the last percussion instrument to be added in is the whirro, and I played the whirro part on it. And I remember actually it becomes so complex and confusing that I wasn't able to watch the conductor and play my part. I had to just look at the gong and bass drum to figure out how my part fit in.
The bass drum, of course, is the anchor there.
Yeah.
So I think that if you, I mean, it's surprising that Stravinsky didn't think of this, but he was clearly going in a different direction. But if you think, you listen to the Cortège Sage, of course, 20 or 30 years after the fact, you may think, well, what happens if we just take any of these layers that are already decoupled, although they still share the same time signature, and you actually got them to speed up or slow down against each other, then you have instant Nancarrow. It's just as simple as that. So although Nancarrow himself never said that passage is what influenced me, he did say that the Rite of Spring influenced him. And I would imagine that if any passage would have influenced him, it would have been that one. I didn't have the opportunity to ask him that question when I met him, unfortunately. But anyway, that's my guess. Incidentally, you asked me about how to pronounce Charles Americanion's surname. He is the person, more than anybody else in the United States, that promoted Nancarrow and visited him several times in Mexico City. So he is the Nancarrow person in the United States, the Nancarrow expert in the United States. A very nice man as well.
And I know another name that would be familiar to percussionists is Frederick Rzewski, who composed To the Earth, which is performed often by percussionists, was also someone to be able to perform these multiple tempo pieces on, live by himself.
The first and most famous arrangement, however, of the Nancarrow pieces was written by a Russian composer who died since, pianist, very famous pianist. I can't remember his name. He lived in London, but he arranged them for the Ensemble Moderne from Frankfurt. Mm-hmm. And I remember having a concert in Frankfurt, and the manager of the Ensemble Moderne gave me a lift when they were just about to release a CD, which was very famous at that time. It became very famous. And he said, and Ligeti, of course, had already made the pronouncements that you read about how important was Nancarrow. And he said, I played this recording. I said to Ligeti that we were doing this, and he said, it's impossible. And then I played him the recording, and he said, this is incredible. I mean, I thought it was impossible, but it isn't. So that's an interesting thing. But I think what you were talking about, simplifying the ideas of Nancarrow, and this so-called, or you can say simplification of, it's not simplification, it's transferring the ideas of Nancarrow into a polyrhythmic world. Because in Nancarrow you don't have polyrhythms, you have each layer, each strand is irrational with regards to the other strand. So they do not share any note value between each other. So that's why it's impossible to keep them in sync, because the player that is playing, even if you have something as simple as crotchets, two players playing crotchets at different speed will never be able to keep track of each other. And that's simple enough, because what criteria do you use to count together? If you have to play, say, 30 crotchets and arrive together at some point, assuming that after 30 crotchets the speed is calculated so that the last crotchet comes together, how can you ever hope to arrive together? There's no way of doing that, because there's no counting that would be shared by the two players. No way of counting. If the two layers are very complex but share some unit, you can use that unit to count. And that's tricky, but it's doable, as is the case in my homage to Nancarrow and Estudios de Frontera. You have a unit, it's a 16th note that you can use to count. And it's Ligeti that thought of that. He is the one who said, okay, I want to write using the ideas of Nancarrow. I want music with multiple simultaneous times, but I want them played by performers, by human performers. So he thought, he claims he got the idea from Chopin, from one of his ballads from his ballad number, what is it, Opus 52, I think it is. And there is a line which has 4 notes against 6 in the right hand and 6 in the left hand. So he thought, okay, what happens if you accent every 4 notes or accent every 6 notes and hide the other 16th notes? You just simply hear the accents, but you're counting in 16 notes. Then, from the listener's point of view, you hear a note repeated every 4 of these 16th notes, and on the other hand, every 6. So 4 against 6 is something that is doable by 2 independent players. So 5 against 4 or 5 against 7, it's possible if the tempo is sufficiently slow and you share the same counting units. Yeah. I don't want to get too technical because there may be some listeners who are not musicians, but basically that is what Ligeti brought into the fray. When by listening to Chopin, of course, in the Chopin piece you never hear the polyrhythms because the music is so fast that what you hear is that the right hand seems to be slowed in a romantic sense on top of an accompaniment. But if you take the same passage and play it much more slowly, then you start hearing the polyrhythms, how the rhythm in the right hand and the left hand interlock together but are very different. Each one suggests a different pulsation. So that's what Ligeti did in his piano etudes, for example, in the autumn in Warsaw. He hides the texture that allows the player, in this case it's just one player, to count, and he accents very strongly notes after, so after 5 notes I accent 1, or after 7 I accent 1, and so you're just hearing the accents and you think, oh, how can these things stay in sync and yet be so different? 5 against 7 against 13, no one can count that. Well, you can if you have a unit that everybody's following. So that's the simplification of Nancarrow, in a way, is not necessarily a simplification, is transforming what is irrational in terms of relationships between layers into something that is now rational, but actually extremely hard to play all the same, because if you're going to conceal this common unit, you still have to hear it, at least the players have to hear it so that they can stay in sync, but conceal it from the audience so that the audience thinks that this music is completely rational, or the layers are completely decoupled from each other. And that's I think that's Ligeti's contribution.
It's like perceiving virtuosity in a different way.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What Boulez said about Ligeti at that time, he said that Ligeti music had, after the mid or late 80s, Ligeti's music had been Nancarrowized. And no one was quite sure if it was supposed to be a compliment or not.
So I had a quick question, actually, and hearing you talk about all this, one thing I've been interested in looking into that I just admittedly haven't, have you ever researched how humans perceive time, and has that ever influenced you to think of how, can humans perceive 2 different timelines at once or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I presented many years ago, probably about now 12 years ago. I had a project with cognitive music / scientist from Cambridge University, a good friend of mine. We went to university together here, Ian Cross, who is one of the top experts in the field, and we presented the project to the Wellcome Trust, which is a funding agency here, for a project that would have involved a year or 2 of research to try to understand what exactly it is the mind does when it perceives and follows 2 strands running at different tempi or at different speeds. And the reason why we proposed this this research was because we thought that composers need to be informed in a more scientific and technical way about where the limits are. We don't know really where the limits are. Intuitively, we know that if you separate 2 lines and you play them with different sounds, it's much easier to follow them. Well, this is true from conventional polyphony, of course. So if you have 2 instruments that are separated in space, the audience finds it a lot easier to follow. Um, Multiple simultaneous times is something that if you play to people a piece with multiple simultaneous times, they don't get it initially. But if you stop and explain to them, and I have tried this with Homage to Nancarrow, for example, when Bob Van Cise and his students played it at the Yale Summer School and the festival there in Connecticut, we had an audience which was mostly of fairly, older people that have not necessarily been exposed to this kind of music. But I took the time to explain to them that if you imagine, I produce an analogy, if you imagine that this marimba is one train and this other marimba is another train and the vibraphone is another train and they're all running at different speeds, but they arrive at the same station at the same time because they catch up with each other or because the trajectory is slower. So it's calculated so that even when they're traveling at different speeds, they come together and then they depart again and come together and depart. And so if you've tried to follow that, you will see how the drama of the piece unfolds. If you've ever been in that concert hall there at the barn in Connecticut, you will see the audience is standing slightly above the stage, and the instruments were fairly sufficiently spread so that they can spatially see the instruments and relate to the sound, and feel that they were separate entities, and so they were able to follow it without any problem. But if I had not explained what it was, it would have been confusing. And in contemporary music, especially the last 50 years or so, there are lots of processes that had been put forward that do not work because audiences can't follow them, and when you explain them to an audience, they still don't work. But simultaneous times is one of those that actually they don't work when you don't explain it, but when you do explain it, if it's well realized, people can follow it and they do find it interesting. So that's why I'm interested in that kind of process, because I think that is one of the truly complex processes that can be perceived by the mind, by the brain, if you have chosen the right register for the voices, if the relationship between the voices is clear enough, if the timbre is appropriate, and all these things. But yeah, it would have been better if we had done the scientific research on the matter. Unfortunately, we got shortlisted, but we didn't get the money in the end. So that's it. I don't know of anybody who's done any I mean, this is a kind of, in a way, neuroscience slash cognitive music slash compositional project, really, investigation, that sort of thing.
It's interesting to me because I feel like if you had a visual aid, if you were watching people hit various percussion instruments at different rates and at different speeds, and then they came back together at the one they started at or something, they would get it. Just makes me think about I guess our last composer, Mark Applebaum, and how many visual pieces he has, but I guess it doesn't talk much about this time relationship. Sorry, Ben, I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
Yeah, real quick, you were talking about, when the instruments are slightly more spread out and people can, perceive these things better. I just had a quick question about your piece, Book of Grooves, because I've never seen a marimba duo that I really thought, like, the setup worked if they have the two instruments like this or they have them spread out. There's always some sort of issue. Have you seen any... Do you have a preference for that piece of the marimbas being close together, further apart? Do you like them angled out, or what?
Well, of course, from the visual point of view, as a member of the audience, you want to see as much as possible what the players are doing. So if you have them all facing the audience, or slightly angled, that's ideal. But from the point of view of the players, they usually want to be facing each other so that they could stay in sync and take visual cues apart from the oral cues from each other. So my preference is to have the two instruments sufficiently separated so that it's easier to hear the independent voices, and also facing the audience, as I said, so that you can really see the gestures and the expanse of the gestures. But yeah, I mean, most of the time players they always say, well, the further apart we are, the harder it is to be in sync, and you have to find some kind of compromise. I think if you play a piece often enough, after a while, the fact that you're not so close together is not so vital. But yeah, I can see the problem there.
We have actually a Facebook question regarding groove.
Yeah.
Brandon Arvay says, so much of your music has groove elements. Are there any specific sources or influences you can cite for this?
Well, I grew up at a time when much of the music around me had a groove, and certainly in the 60s, there was a lot of music that had a groove. So that's something that I simply grew up with it, and that would inevitably influence you because it's part of your soundscape. It would be difficult to mention a specific influence, as in this or that musician or this or that band. The notion of a groove, or the groove, comes from jazz, and it was then developed further in rock music, and especially in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. So I grew up listening to some jazz, but I also I listened to rock music more because of the music of my generation, especially in the 60s, 70s. But I also played professionally in rock band. So I was influenced by all the the rock music of that time, both as a listener but also as a player.
What did you play in the rock band?
Guitar.
Okay.
I trained as a classical player, but also played in a rock band. So of course, at that time you also had the music we used to listen to a lot was soul music, the Motown tracks, those famous Motown tracks from the late 50s, 60s, and even 70s, which so often were based on a groove as well. And of course, the blues-based rock that was riff-based and groove-based, which I've drawn from in several of my pieces. So a riff is not necessarily a groove, but it often creates a groove. So I'm thinking of people like Jimi Hendrix or bands like Cream and Zeppelin, or Jethro Tull, and of course even the Beatles and the earlier bands. All of that is part of my upbringing. So the groove is part of my, as I said, my soundscape. So it wouldn't be one specific type of groove. It was the groove being around me everywhere, more or less, and simply part of my musical background.
Yeah, great. I really like how you manipulate groove. There's a lot of music we encounter that is just constantly polyrhythmic and constantly a partial of a 5, a partial of a 6, a partial of a 4, and then 2 even 3s, and you never get to appreciate all that intricate rhythm because there's no basis. So con variations, for example, it's really nice, I think, to hear something you can hang on to, and then you do all this fancy rhythmic manipulation to the point that you can appreciate it, and it has some utility.
Yeah, and I think the idea of having a groove with it makes it, I hate to say this because it sounds like an insult to so much contemporary music, but it makes it more listenable. People can connect with it.
Ben,
I always work on the principle or the notion that I'm going to make a literary comparison, but if you want to write, have we been cut off? No. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, you're still good.
Okay. If you want to write music which has large-scale form, which is what classical Western or contemporary Western music is about, is large-scale form. It has gone through many changes and processes. It's more or less counterpoint, more or less this and that, more or less another form, but it's basically large-scale narrative. A piece of music that starts with some musical idea and then it transforms it and goes somewhere else after 15, 10, 20 minutes, whatever. So it's not like popular music, which is recursive. It is changing the initial musical idea and taking it somewhere else. If you're going to do that, which is the equivalent of a novel, you introduce a character and then things begin to happen and change completely the life of the character and whatever. So if you don't know the character, if the character doesn't mean anything to you, if you're not familiar, if the character is not believable, then whatever happens to the character is not going to be very interesting. Conversely, if you have the character is completely believable to you, you're prepared to accept anything. If you take a classic like Don Quixote, well, of course, in what way is the man attacking the windmills going to be very credible or interesting? But by the time he attacks the windmills, you become familiar with him and Sancho, and they're characters that you absolutely believe in spite of the fact that whatever happens to them is unbelievable. Or to take a contemporary piece of television, if you think of Breaking Bad, well, who is going to believe what happens to Mr. White as he turns into Heisenberg? But you accept that because over the course of all these episodes, you get to believe in him as a human being, as a personality. So then when all of these improbable things happen to him, never mind, it's happening to somebody you really believe in. So the musical equivalent is, if you're going to introduce a process that is complex, like complex polyrhythms, the simulation of multiple simultaneous times, the feeling that one line is accelerating against the other. But this happens to a character that you don't even recognize. How on earth is the listener going to find this interesting? He's not going to understand anything. So on the other hand, if you start with a very obvious character that is completely clear, a musical statement that is clear, whether it's a groove, a riff, a melodic cell, or any kind of simple, immediate, and comprehensible musical statement, that anything that happens to that statement will be something that you will be affected by. You would say, oh, look what happened to that. Oh, it's turned into that. Oh, now it's juxtaposed to some other version of itself. So then you can be interested in the process, which is what serious Western music is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about the original idea. It's supposed to be about the process of transformation. It's supposed to be about large-scale form. So then it makes sense to start with something very simple rather than with something complex. And so I try to follow that criteria when I compose music.
I think we can't just mention Breaking Bad. We got to go talk about this for a few hours now. Did you find you got more composing done when Breaking Bad was over?
No, well, not necessarily, because it wasn't shown on television here, so in England. So it still has not been shown. So you had to download it from some place or other. So I downloaded it at my leisure. So yes, but yeah, of course it was very gripping, and everybody was talking about when is the next episode coming out, and so on. Yeah.
This one from Joseph McMoran does mention Nancarrow, but I think moves on to some other things. After studying and drawing inspiration from Nancarrow, where do you see percussion music in 10 to 15 years or beyond? With the use of electronic playback, in-ear Bluetooth devices, and collaboration of both acoustic and electronic, what does the future potentially hold for percussion music as we know it?
Good question.
Yeah, well, it's, making pronouncements about the future is the best way of making a fool of yourself. But I'm going to start by reminding you of that famous phrase by Woody Allen in one of his films. I can't remember which one it was, where he said, if you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plans. So yeah, You think that this is, music is going to go in this direction. Well, tell God about it, and he start laughing, because the only thing we can be absolutely sure about with regards to the future is that it's going to turn out to be different than we imagined it to be. But if we restrict ourselves to making or to speculating about things that are within the realm of the fairly probable. Many years ago, when technology first started appearing, I was young, of course, and foolish. So I said, in the future, all music will be mediated by technology, and music that is not mediated by technology will be actually shunned by an audience, and that turned out to be correct. Even when you hear, you're a percussionist, when you hear a tabla today, you very rarely hear a tabla in concert unless it's amplified, and the actual sound of the tabla that we hear is, people are familiar with, is the close mic sound, which is not what you get if you're standing 20 meters away from a tabla in a big concert hall. But if an Indian group comes to play in London, they will be amplified, and everything is amplified. The only thing that is not amplified is Western classical traditional music, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why we are losing an audience. But so if you speculate that more and more music will be mediated by technology, then you have to say that percussion music also will find itself, like all the rest, if it wants to evolve with the times, using more and more technology, and that presumably it suggests that more and more composers will be composing pieces for percussion with electronics, and the performers in turn will be more willing to perform them, even if that involves taking some technology with them when they're touring and traveling. And I think there is some evidence that that's happening already. But there is another reason why I imagine that would have to happen, which is this. Percussion music has one great advantage over other musical lineups, in classical music, I mean, but also one great disadvantage. One great advantage is that if you say to young people your generation, hey, come to a concert, there are all these percussion instrument, marimbas and whatever, and it's really loud and powerful and funky, whatever. A lot of them would say marimbas. Yeah, of course, they're close friends, they know because you play marimba, but they would say, marimba, what is a marimba? It's like a xylophone, but huge. It's a really sexy instrument. Come and watch it. So they'll come and watch it. But if you say, come and listen to Mozart played by a string quartet, most of them will say, absolutely no way. I have things to do. I have to go out with my girlfriend or whatever. Because a string quartet smells of classical Western music, which puts so many young people off. They want nothing to do with it, for better or worse. Sad as it may be, it's a fact of life. Why is it that percussion music doesn't sound like classical music, although it's taught in conservatories as part of the classical Western tradition? Because people associate in their minds with other things, with rock music, with pop music. It's percussion. Percussion, that can't be the same as Mozart. He didn't write any percussion music, so there is no connection. So you are lucky in that your tradition is not besmirched in the eyes of young generations by this bad connotation of being classical, boring Western music. But you have a problem, which is the sound world of percussion music, when it comes to pitch, is limited. So, for example, you have a very poor bottom end of the register. The marimba goes down to C, but doesn't project well from G and below. And there are no other instruments that can pitch a note properly down there. You can have loudness with a grand casa, but you can't have loud pitch. And most of the music we hear around, you go to a club, you go to a concert, whatever, has a loud pitched bass. So you don't have that in percussion. You also don't have any way of projecting sustained sounds other than the vibraphone, but that's limited. And you don't have a clear top unless you want to use the glockenspiel all the time, which after a while saturates your ear. So you have a problem with timbre and with the projection of sound. That's the problem. Now, if you join forces with other forces, string players, guitars, whatever, then you solve the problem. But you're not doing that. And why aren't you doing that? For a very simple reason. And I know this because I've suggested millions of times. I always get the same response from people who run some of the top percussion studios in the top schools in America, or that have percussion ensembles. Well, you know, Alejandro, we can't tour with. We can't invite an extra 3-4 players. We can't tour with them. You know, that's not viable. Or they will say, well, yeah, we could. You know, if it's in a school, they could say, well, yeah, we can get string players from the string department, but they have a different schedule, and it would be very hard to organize it. No, that's a problem. So even when I wrote my sextet, and I introduced the piano, and I surveyed the people commissioning it to see whether it was okay to have a piano. They said, yeah, it's okay, but it would be better if you did not have the piano. But a piano solves many of those problems. It solves the register problem, the sustain to some extent, and the top register. And it is a percussion instrument after all. It speaks at the same speed as a marimba. So it has all the advantages, none of the disadvantages. On top of that, many percussion players also play the piano. So if the piano part is not impossibly difficult, you can get away with not having to invite somebody from some other department, which seems to be such a problem even if they live in the same building. For so if you have all of these things going against you, because yes, it's so easy to mingle with other players, but it's simply not going to happen, then technology can solve all of these problems. Because now you can have all the sustained sounds you want, you can have all the bottom you want, all the top you want, anything else you want. So you can have the best of both worlds. You stay within your percussion pals, you don't have to invite anybody else, and you don't need to tour with an extra 4 or 5 players. All you need to have is your laptop, which you already own, some software there, a small mixer, and then wherever you go, they should provide a decent pair of speakers and you know, a PA, which more and more is pretty much decent everywhere you go. In the old days, you had to carry your own because what they would provide was awful. But now it's getting better more or less everywhere. So I think that suggests that in the future, that's the obvious direction to go into. It has all the benefits and practically no disadvantages. But once again, I would say, you know, tell God what your plans are, and He'll laugh. And predict the future, and you know, something will happen that will derail your prediction and will go into some other direction. Personally, I would be very happy if it moved in that direction, because I think that I was forgetting about one other thing. You put together electronic sounds with the percussion, and for the younger generation, that lives quite happily in the soundscape of our time. That could be part of what? The rock tradition, the jazz tradition, the hip-hop tradition, the whatever. Nobody knows what tradition it is, but it's certainly one that most people would feel comfortable with. So there you are. That's my opinion on the matter.
You know, just for the sake of argument, I've heard before some people say, I don't like more electronic playback utilization because it takes away the human performance aspect, and it's just a matter of time until we're no longer actually performing music, we're only listening to it. How do you respond to that? I mean, I think we're all in agreement here. We like electroacoustic music and we like pieces with playback, but do you ever encounter that criticism, and do you have a response for it?
Well, I did about 500 years ago, but not this side of Tutankhamun. So I would reply very simply, okay, people said that, well, you're too young to remember this, but I'll tell you, when Emerson, Lake and Palmer, you know what I'm talking about? You know who they were? Okay, yep. This is 1971 you're talking about. None of you were probably born, or you were very little, but at that time, people said, ooh, a synthesizer band, because in those days, if a rock band had a synthesizer, it was called a synthesizer band. Now it would be ridiculous. They all have. Okay? So they said, oh, that's the end of rock music as we know it. Was it the end?
Wow. Yeah, okay.
46 years ago, and it did not happen. So that's your answer. What else can I say?
Yeah, cool. No, that's great. That's a great response, because usually I engage that argument, and it ends up being kind of a complex thing. But I'm going to use that. That's a great response.
Do you really see Beyonce replaced by a synthesizer? I don't.
Well, of course we don't. You know, I think some people, I think that the people who bring up this argument are pretty ignorant to what electronic music and electroacoustic music is in general. But I always seem to run into one here or there that just says, well, you just played a recording, that's not hard. And I mean, of course they don't know what all is involved there. You guys, hey, this was really fantastic. Alejandro, Viñao, it's so great when we get a guest who's willing to give us that much substance. Thank you so much. That was really, really enlightening.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, that was so much fun, and if you ever let us have you again, we would love to do so. One quick little housekeeping item, because we had him on the episode, Jason Baker, we were talking about the release of his CD on his episode, and it's out, it's available. So just to follow up on that, that's there. And yeah, you guys, thanks so much for the questions. We actually had a few more. Ted Jackson, sorry we didn't get to your question this time. But again, Alejandro, thanks so much. And you guys all have a great day. We'll talk to you. See you next time.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You're very welcome.